very hard to save the world in its entirety. So there has to be a balance between, generating returns on our capital, but at the same time, deploying that capital for the greater good.
Mention the word Novo in the context of healthcare, and two prominent medications will likely come to mind: Ozempic and Wegovy. These drugs have been widely used for the treatment of diabetes and obesity, but their potential could extend to a whole host of other conditions like heart disease and even Parkinson's. The company that makes them, Novo Nordisk, is now worth more than the entire Danish economy. And what's interesting about Novo Nordisk is its corporate structure. It is ultimately owned by the Novo Nordisk Foundation, a Danish enterprise foundation whose assets and wealth are managed by Novo Holdings. Novo Holdings is now one of the largest life science investors in the world, with assets under management of 149 billion euros at the end of 2023. And I'm joined by Dr. Amit Kakar, managing partner and head of Asia at Novo Holdings. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Pam. It's a pleasure.
Now, Doctor, there's no denying that these two drugs that we mentioned have an outsized impact for those particular diseases and treatments that they currently have. But what are the wider implications?
So if you look at the changing population trends in the world today, there's aging population all across the globe. There is more and more NCDs and non-communicable diseases, which means a rise of cardiometabolic diseases, a rise of areas of stroke, obesity, as you actually mentioned. So we believe that these GLP-1 drugs, as you mentioned about, Ozempic and Wegovy, go beyond just the treatment of obesity and diabetes. They're actually a new generation of treatments for growing cardiometabolic disease and neurodegenerative diseases as we go forward.
And what I think is interesting, one of the things you talked about, which is the structure. Not only are these, the corporate profits, I should say, from these drugs essentially being funneled into further research and development, into a whole range of other companies and potential future breakthroughs. Has there ever been investments as such to this scale?
So Novo Holdings, which I'm a part of, is 100% owned by the Novo Nordisk Foundation. Such a structure is pretty unprecedented, because if you look at how we are structured today, Novo Holdings is managing the assets of the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which then in turn actually deploys the capital again in the areas of planetary health, healthcare and life sciences. And the return on the capital generated goes back to the foundation, which then deploys that capital for the greater good of both science and innovation. So such a structure allows us to do both investments, but at the same time do the betterment and the greater good of the planet and the society overall.
Of course, Novo Nordisk is now bigger than the Danish economy, which we mentioned earlier. This creates somewhat of a Nokia risk. Is Novo Holdings diversifying both sectorally as well as geographically to avoid a so-called Nokia risk?
If you remember about what happened with Nokia, it was actually a risk of not investing in the future of technology. If you look at Novo Holdings today, we are present in US, Europe, and now in Asia. At the same time, from an investment perspective, we invest in everything from healthcare, life sciences, planetary health, but at the same time, we have a division which we call it as capital investments, or CI, that actually invests in non-healthcare entities. So areas like infrastructure, fixed income, bonds, public security, and the purpose of that is to give us the wide diversification.
You studied medicine in India, but you've certainly had a very global career in various different places, Hong Kong, the US, and other markets as well. What has more than 25 years of sort of this global experience taught you about the biggest healthcare challenges that exist?
I trained as a medical doctor and then sort of went into the whole corporate part of healthcare to begin with, and then the investment part in healthcare. So a few observations from my side. One, the world is aging. There is a large aging population. And if you look at just between Asia, the 2/3 of the world population resides in Asia. And we believe that in the next decade, you would have anywhere between 20% of population in China, Japan, and India above the age of 60 years, which also means that there is a heavier burden of treating NCDs in a country like China itself is around $200 billion.
Huge burden.
It's a huge burden. So the biggest challenge I see is how do we make, one, affordability of treatment of these diseases, but the other more pertinent point is accessibility.
Now, the cost of healthcare expenditure, as you mentioned, is really expensive, and the cost of developing new drugs is even in the tens of hundreds of millions of dollars. How do you draw on your experience when deciding what to put your capital behind?
Exactly. I think, again, a question that defines our investment strategy and thesis. And I just led it last time about affordability and accessibility. But I also believe that tech is going to play a very, very important role in making that affordability and accessibility possible. So I'll give you some examples. One of the biggest challenges is you have limited number of doctors today and a huge population of patients who need that treatment. And the right solution to that was telehealth and telemedicine, which actually saw a huge spike during COVID. Now, it's been around for decades, but the actual usage picked up during COVID because patients had a real need to see the doctors and they couldn't see them physically. So providing that kind of access, providing that kind of behavioral change of patients to be able to access their doctors while even sitting miles away, I think that's one area of investment that we have.
And you mentioned earlier about a balance. Now, there are also the rare diseases that need to be treated. However, they might be less profitable for a company to invest in. Is there a role for Novo Holdings to play in this spectrum?
Absolutely, and we're doing it right now. So if you look at some of the advent of rare diseases in the world today, and the areas of treatment around them, like the cell and gene therapy, Novo Holdings is actively investing in that. And one area I want to emphasize on is the area of genomics. So genomics, when first was developed, a whole genome sequencing would cost close to about $100,000. Today, with the new advancement in NGS, the generation sequencing technologies, we've actually brought it down to a few $100s.
So what does success look like to you? Is it a balance between profit, or is it more about saving the world? What does it look like?
Well, look, in true honesty, it's very hard to save the world in its entirety. So there has to be a balance between, generating returns on our capital, but at the same time, deploying that capital for the greater good. And that's where the unique combination of our ownership by the foundation, which we are owned by 100%, as I mentioned earlier, but at the same time, Novo Holdings focus on generating return, which the foundation then deploys that capital for the greater good of the humanity and the planetary health, I think makes a big difference.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that insightful discussion. A big thank you to our special guest, Dr. Amit Kakar, Managing Partner and Head of Asia at Novo Holdings. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of I See Your Trade, Season 5. I See Your Trade is brought to you by IC Markets, a leading high-performance trading provider. Trade up to IC Markets. See you next time.